Somewhere in the Nevada desert, past a checkpoint most Americans will never be allowed to cross, there is a neighborhood that was built to die. Two-story colonial houses. Furniture from the department store. Mannequins dressed for dinner, seated at tables that were never meant to be eaten at. The United States government built this town on purpose, populated it on purpose, and then detonated a nuclear weapon less than a mile away on purpose just to watch what happened to the people who weren't really people at all. That town still exists in fragments, monitored to this day for radiation, and it's not even the darkest place on this list. Stay with me, because by the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why some of Nevada's ghost towns aren't just abandoned. They're forbidden. Nevada has more ghost towns than any other state in the country, and that's not an accident. It's a desert built on booms and busts, on silver veins that ran out overnight, and water rights that dried up entire cities before they'd even finished being built. Today we're counting down 10 of the strangest, darkest, and most restricted of them. From a town that faked its own violence to sell tickets, to a town that was flooded on purpose and keeps refusing to stay underwater. Every location, every date, and every dark detail in this video comes from verified historical sources, because these places don't need exaggeration. The real history is strange enough on its own. Some of these towns you can still walk through today. One of them you technically cannot, not without government clearance and a scheduled seat on a bus. Before we start, if you're the kind of person who likes wandering into places most people forget existed, go ahead and subscribe. It helps this channel keep finding them. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. Now let's get into the desert. Number 10 is Unionville, tucked into Buena Vista Canyon in Pershing County. It was founded in 1861 after Paiute prospectors pointed settlers toward silver in the surrounding hills, and within 2 years it had grown into the seat of Humboldt County, home to around 1,500 people spread across 3 distinct camps that, oddly enough, divided themselves along Civil War loyalties. One of those people was a broke, restless 20-something named Samuel Clemens. You know him better as Mark Twain. He came to Unionville chasing the same silver rush as everyone else, lived in a crude structure cut into the hillside with a canvas roof and a hole for smoke to escape, and left less than a month later having found nothing but disappointment. He later described the town with his usual bite as 11 cabins and a liberty pole. By 1870, the rich ore was gone, the Central Pacific Railroad bypassed the valley entirely, and the new town of Winnemucca stole away both the county seat and the trade routes that had kept Unionville alive. Today, fewer than 30 people still call it home, and a cabin still stands bearing Twain's name. One of the last places in Nevada where a legend of American literature failed spectacularly at getting rich. It's a quiet start. What comes next is anything but. Number 9 is Metropolis, in Elko County, and unlike almost every other town on this list, it wasn't built on gold or silver. It was built on a promise. In 1909, a New York land development firm called the Pacific Reclamation Company bought 40,000 acres of high desert and announced plans for a farming utopia. A planned city of 7,500 people surrounded by wheat fields. They built a grand hotel, a brick schoolhouse, a rail spur, and an amusement hall, and even constructed a 100-foot dam to irrigate the surrounding farmland. Then reality caught up with the marketing. Downstream ranchers in the Lovelock Valley sued over water rights and won, and the court allowed the company to irrigate only a fraction of the 40,000 acres it had promised to settlers. Farmers tried dry farming instead, and for a couple of unusually wet years. It almost worked. Then came a typhoid outbreak in the winter of 1915, and then came the animals. Settlers had hunted down the local coyotes, and without predators, the jackrabbit population exploded and ate through what little crop remained. Then came a plague of Mormon crickets that swarmed the fields and finished the job. The hotel, built with bricks salvaged from the San Francisco earthquake, burned in 1936. By 1947, the school closed for good, and the great agricultural dream of Metropolis was reduced to a single brick archway standing alone in the sagebrush, guarding a town that never got the chance it was promised. Number 8 is Belmont. Once the seat of Nye County and one of the richest silver camps in the state, running 6 separate ore mills and pulling around $15 million in silver out of the ground during its boom years in the late 1800s. The town's Italianate brick courthouse, completed in 1876, still stands, one of the best preserved government buildings left in any Nevada ghost town, alongside the ruins of the once famous Cosmopolitan Saloon and Dance Hall. But Belmont's strangest chapter came almost a century after the silver ran out. According to accounts documented by Nevada mining historians, a young Charles Manson and members of his group once tried to camp inside the abandoned courthouse, only to be run off the property. Visitors who've toured the building since have pointed to carved names scratched into the old walls, said to include his. Whether every detail of that story survives scrutiny or not, what's certain is that Belmont's Grand Courthouse outlived the silver boom, outlived the county seat status it lost in 1905, and quietly became a stop on one of the darkest footnotes in American crime history. From a courthouse with a criminal legend attached to it, we head toward a town that photographs like nowhere else on Earth. Number 7 is Rhyolite, arguably Nevada's most photographed ghost town, sitting in the Bullfrog Hills near the eastern edge of Death Valley. It began in 1904 after prospectors Frank Harris and Ernest Cross struck high-grade gold ore, and within about a year, a 2-tent mining camp had exploded into a town of thousands, served by 4 daily stagecoaches connecting it to the wider Bullfrog mining district. By 1907, Rhyolite had electric lights, concrete sidewalks, a hospital, an opera house, and the Cook Bank Building, a 3-story structure with marble staircases and mahogany finishings that cost roughly $90,000 to construct. Financier Charles Schwab poured money into the Montgomery Shoshone mine, and for a moment, Rhyolite looked like it might become a permanent Nevada city. Then a new valuation exposed the mine as overhyped around 1909, and the town collapsed almost as fast as it had risen. By 1916, the lights went out for good. By 1920, only 14 people remained. What's left today is genuinely eerie, crumbling stone facades standing in rows along empty streets, a bank building that once hosted early Hollywood film shoots, and one house built entirely out of roughly 10,000 discarded beer bottles, still standing when almost everything else has fallen. Rhyolite proves a boomtown can die in barely a decade. Our next stop shows what happens when a mining camp accidentally uncovers something 225 million years older than the mine itself. Number 6 is Berlin, deep in the Shoshone Mountains of central Nevada. Silver mining began nearby in the 1860s, but Berlin itself wasn't established until 1897, when the Nevada Company bought the mine and the surrounding claims. At its peak, Berlin and its neighboring settlement of Union supported 200 to 300 people, including miners, woodcutters, a doctor, a nurse, and a forest ranger. The mine produced roughly $850,000 in gold before a 1907 labor strike crippled operations, and by 1911 the town was finished. That alone would make Berlin a fairly typical Nevada ghost town, one of dozens now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. What makes it strange is what was found underneath it. In 1928, a geologist noticed unusual eroded rock on the hillside above the town site. Excavations that began in the 1950s eventually uncovered nearly 40 fossilized ichthyosaurs, massive marine reptiles up to 50 feet long, dating back roughly 225 million years, to a time when this entire desert basin sat under a shallow arm of the Pacific Ocean. Miners spent decades digging for silver directly above the largest known concentration of ichthyosaur fossils in North America, with absolutely no idea it was there. Today, Berlin's wooden buildings still stand in a deliberate state of arrested decay, a mining ghost town resting quietly on top of a prehistoric graveyard. Number 5 takes us to Goldfield, once the largest and wealthiest city in the entire state of Nevada. Gold was discovered here in 1902, and by the peak of the boom, Goldfield's population reached roughly 20,000 people. Supporting 3 newspapers, 5 banks, its own stock exchange, and a saloon so long it reportedly needed 80 bartenders working at once. At the center of it all stood the Goldfield Hotel, opened in 1908 with a mahogany-paneled lobby, gold leaf ceilings, and one of the first elevators in the state. But the gold that built Goldfield started running out by 1910, and the disasters that followed didn't help. A flash flood tore through town in 1913. A fire caused by a moonshine still destroyed roughly 25 city blocks in 1923. By the 1930s, the once grand hotel had become little more than a flophouse, and it closed for good in 1945 after briefly housing Army Air Corps personnel from a nearby airbase. Today, Goldfield survives as what's often called a living ghost town, home to only a couple hundred residents. But the hotel remains one of the most talked about buildings in the American West, regularly named among the most haunted locations in the country, and featured on more paranormal investigation shows than almost any other site in Nevada. It's Room 109 mentioned again and again by visitors and investigators alike. 250 people now live among the ruins of a city built for 20,000. Our next stop didn't collapse by accident. It collapsed by design, over and over, on purpose, for money. Number 4 is Palisade. And this is where Nevada's ghost towns stop being merely abandoned and start being genuinely strange. Palisade was founded in 1868 as a stop along the Central Pacific Railroad, later growing further once the Eureka and Palisade Railroad connected it to the mining town of Eureka in 1875, with a modest population that peaked around 600. By the mid-1870s, though, the mining economy around it had gone flat, and locals grew tired of watching disappointed train passengers step off. Expecting the wild, lawless West they'd read about in dime novels, and finding instead a dull, orderly little railroad town. So, according to multiple historical accounts, the residents decided to give the tourists exactly what they wanted. Whenever a passenger train pulled in for its lunch stop, the town would stage an elaborate performance, fake gunfights, mock bank robberies, staged hangings. Even simulated confrontations involving members of a local Shoshone community who were recruited into the act. They used blank ammunition and gallons of animal blood from a nearby slaughterhouse to sell the illusion. Terrified passengers scrambled for cover under train cars while cast members reenacted brutal violence just feet away. Word spread east. Newspapers reported on the shocking lawlessness of Palisade, and not one of those reporters realized the entire town was in on the joke. In reality, Palisade's crime rate was close to 0, and it didn't even employ a sheriff. This went on for roughly 3 profitable years before the act quietly died out. In 2005, a descendant of the town's former landowner sold the entire ghost town at auction for $150,000 to fund his daughter's college education. Palisade didn't die from a disaster. It staged one, deliberately, for cash, and got away with it for years. That's 4 entries down, and we're only warming up, because what's ahead gets considerably heavier. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the places most people drive right past, take a second and hit subscribe. More of these are coming. Now, back into the desert. Number 3 is St. Thomas. And unlike everything else on this list, this town wasn't abandoned because the money ran out. It was abandoned because the federal government decided to drown it. St. Thomas was settled by Mormon pioneers in 1865 along the Muddy River in what's now southern Nevada, built on ground that ancient basket maker and Pueblo peoples had already farmed for more than 1,000 years before them, and it grew into a modest farming community with a school, a hotel, and a grocery store. Its fate was sealed in 1928. When Congress authorized construction of what would become the Hoover Dam. As the dam backed up the Colorado River, Lake Mead began to fill in 1935, and the waters crept steadily toward St. Thomas. Most residents left as the water rose. One man, Hugh Lord, stayed until the very end, reportedly burning his own house down before rowing away from his front door as the lake swallowed the last of the town. By 1938, St. Thomas sat roughly 60 feet underwater. But here's the part that makes this town different from every other flooded settlement in America. It refuses to stay buried. Over the following decades, drought repeatedly lowered Lake Mead enough for St. Thomas to resurface, its stone foundations breaking the surface like something the desert itself is trying to remember. It vanished again in wetter years and disappeared from view entirely between 1972 and 2002 before resurfacing once more. Today, with the lake at historically low levels, the ruins of St. Thomas sit fully exposed, dry, dusty streets where visitors once needed a boat to travel. A ghost town that was deliberately drowned, and that keeps coming back anyway. Number 2 is Delamar, and this is where the countdown stops being about buildings and starts being about bodies. Founded in the early 1890s in Lincoln County, Delamar grew fast after Captain Joseph DeLamar, a mining investor originally from Montana, bought up the district's mining claims in 1894. By 1897, the population had reached roughly 3,000 people, and the town was producing more ore than anywhere else in the state, eventually totaling somewhere between $8 and $13 million in gold, all of it hauled 150 miles by mule team to the nearest railhead in Milford, Utah. It had a hospital, an opera house, churches, a newspaper, even its own Masonic lodge relocated from nearby Pioche. But Delamar's gold was locked inside quartzite, a hard, glass-like rock, and crushing it released an incredibly fine silica dust into the air. Because water was scarce in this stretch of desert, the mining process ran dry far more often than it should have, and that dust settled directly into the lungs of the men who worked there. The result was widespread, brutal silicosis, a disease that scarred and hardened the lungs until breathing itself became a slow death sentence. Historical accounts describe hundreds of women in the town left widowed by the disease, so many that Delamar earned a nickname that has outlived almost everything else about it: the Widowmaker. A fire tore through half the town in 1900. Captain Delamar sold out shortly after. Mining limped along until 1909, with a brief revival in the early 1930s, before the site was abandoned for good. Delamar isn't remembered for its silver or its architecture. It's remembered as a town where the ground itself killed the people trying to pull wealth out of it. Which brings us to number 1, The entry that started this entire video. The desert town the United States government built specifically to destroy, and the reason it's still, to this day, one of the most restricted stretches of land in the country. Deep inside what is now the Nevada National Security Site, roughly 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas, sits a stretch of desert called Yucca Flat. Between 1951 and 1992, the federal government detonated nearly 1,000 nuclear devices across this site, more than anywhere else on the planet. With the very first atmospheric test conducted at nearby Frenchman Flat in January of 1951. But in 1953 and again in 1955, the government did something stranger than simply testing bombs in empty desert. They built entire mock American neighborhoods from scratch, nicknamed Doomtown and, in its second iteration, Survival Town. These weren't rough sets. They were fully furnished two-story homes, built from real construction materials, stocked with department store furniture, filled with food in the refrigerators, and populated with mannequins dressed in ordinary 1950s clothing, seated at dinner tables, tucked into beds, positioned on porches, standing on sidewalks next to parked cars. During the Annie test in March of 1953, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite broadcast live from a hillside 10 miles away as one of those houses, sitting 3,500 feet from the blast, was obliterated in an instant. A second house, positioned farther out at roughly 7,500 feet, was damaged but left standing, and it's charred. Splintered frame became one of the defining images of the atomic age. During the Apple II test in 1955, the government repeated the experiment, filming high-speed footage of paint blistering off the walls milliseconds before the shockwave arrived to tear the structures apart. The goal, officially, was civil defense research, an attempt to understand how ordinary American homes and the families theoretically living in them would survive a nuclear attack. Unofficially, the images that came out of Doomtown did the opposite of reassuring the public. Newspapers ran photos of the wrecked empty homes and the shattered mannequins inside them, and instead of easing nuclear anxiety, they deepened it. Some structural remnants of Survival Town still exist within the test site today, one of the most radioactively monitored patches of land in the United States, and it remains under federal control, closed to the public except for rare, tightly scheduled tours that require advance clearance months ahead of time. It is, quite literally, forbidden ground. A ghost town that was never meant to hold people in the first place, built only so it could be erased, and it still isn't fully open to the country that built it. 10 strange, dark, and in one case genuinely restricted corners of the Nevada desert, from a professor's cabin abandoned by Mark Twain to a neighborhood the government built just to blow it up. Nevada has more of these places than any other state, scattered across a landscape so dry and so empty that entire cities can vanish into it and barely leave a trace. Some were killed by drought. Some were killed by fire. One was killed by dust in the air, and one was never really alive at all, just a stage set built for a single catastrophic afternoon. And yet somehow, all 10 still stand out there, in one form or another, waiting in the silence for the next person curious enough to go looking. If this kind of deep, verified dive into forgotten America is something you want more of, subscribe and stick around, because the desert isn't finished giving up its secrets. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.